United States is seeking to make space a new arena of war. U.S. military documents speak of having the U.S. control space and from space dominate the Earth below. The U.S. military wants to base weapons in space. And now with George W. Bush and Richard Cheney in power, the country has an administration intimately linked to the corporate and arch-conservative interests which, with the U.S. military, have been seeking to turn space into a war zone. Star Wars is back, and there's only a narrow window to stop the U.S. plans from going forward and preventing what inevitably would follow. Other nations meeting the U.S. in kind and an arms race and ultimately war in space. And there's only a narrow window to strengthen the Outer Space Treaty, the landmark 1967 international treaty that seeks to keep war out of space, that sets aside space for peaceful purposes. The U.S. space warfare plans are explicitly laid out in documents, including the Vision for 2020 report of the U.S. Space Command, which was set up to coordinate U.S. space warfare activities. Here's the report, which features a laser weapon firing a beam down from space, zapping a target on Earth. Vision for 2020 starts out, U.S. Space Command dominating the space dimension of military operations to protect U.S. interest and investment, integrating space forces into warfighting capabilities across the full spectrum of conflict. The model? The U.S. Space Command compares the U.S. effort to control space and the Earth below to how centuries ago nations built navies to protect and enhance their commercial interests, how the great empires of Europe ruled the waves and thus the world.
U.S. policy at every front, certainly the congressional front and more importantly the executive front, say quite explicitly that it is our moral right and our duty to use unilateral control as often as possible. And to that extent, I think one has to say that you can't blame the Space Command or the directors of the intelligence agencies because they are merely doing what our civilian leadership wants them to do in a very expressed nature. Now, the civilian leadership on their front can say, really, our entire culture expects a winner-take-all attitude toward space domination and planetary domination.
The blueprint for the space military program of the Bush-Cheney administration is this document, issued in early 2001, the report of the Space Commission chaired by the new Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. In the coming period, states the report, the U.S. will conduct operations to, from, in, and through space in support of its national interests, both on the Earth and in space. The report urges the U.S. president have the option to deploy weapons in space. It stresses the projection of power through and from space in response to events anywhere in the world. The Rumsfeld Space Commission recommends a transition of the U.S. Space Command to a Space Corps, a quasi-independent military arm like the Marine Corps. The Rumsfeld Space Commission was set up by legislation authored by Senator Bob Smith of New Hampshire. Smith says of U.S. control of space,
it is our manifest destiny. You know, we went from the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States of America, settling a continent, and they call that manifest destiny. Well, now the next continent, if you will, the next frontier is space, and it goes on forever. The assets are unlimited.
Everyone in the civilian community, as well as the intelligence agency and Space Command leadership, honestly believe that the United States deserved the fruits, so to speak, of winning the Cold War, and that we are in a position now where the United States is the only one, in their eyes, that has the right to claim sole ownership of space, and are not about to let others impinge upon space in a way that would threaten U.S. national security interests. The problem is that these leaders in the United States government believe they are the only ones who have the right to say what use of space is right and wrong.
Vision for 2020 stresses the global economy, of which the U.S. is the engine. says the U.S. Space Command, the globalization of the world economy will also continue with a widening between haves and have-nots. The view is that by controlling space and the Earth below, the U.S. will be able to keep those have-nots in line. The U.S. military not only acknowledges, it proudly points to U.S. corporations being involved in helping set U.S. space military doctrine.
The documents that have come out of the Space Command over the last few years have talked about a power reach far beyond the borders, the physical borders of the United States. And in their own rationale for their extension of power, they talk about the need to protect United States interests and investments worldwide. They're not talking about defending our own towns and villages from an invader. They're talking about protecting this huge globalization dynamic that is more or less a new form of colonization for the rest of the world. It's a little bit like the cavalry following the original settlers. That finally, if you are taking something that there is conflict about, you have to have the cavalry. And the cavalry to this new power reach and power grab is increasingly the space forces of the United States.
But I always knew the military force is the only way the markets can work. It's like the British. It's like the British brought their warships. It's like the Gulf War, controlling the oil, but that the marketplace has been turned into a battlefield. And I think it should be stopped. I think it is insane. And we cannot afford to have a handful of politicians and military people respond to the world from a position of deep fear and deep panic. Because this kind of violence only comes from fear. And we cannot afford the kind of violence they're getting ready to unleash on the world because of their ignorance and their fear. Because if they were not ignorant about how people live, they would not be threatened by ordinary people living on their 1 acre patch of land, managing to defend biodiversity and look after future generations. That's all people, most people in the world want, a little peace for themselves and the future. And that little dream of peace is being annihilated. And I don't think it's right, and I don't think it's fair.
With the Bush-Cheney takeover, the U.S. has an administration thoroughly gung-ho for Star Wars. It's loaded with figures intimately linked to the corporate and arch-conservative interests that have, with the U.S. military, been pushing for space warfare. Vice President Cheney himself was a member of the board of TRW, his wife Lynn a board member of Lockheed Martin, both major Star Wars contractors. In the Bush choice of Donald Rumsfeld as U.S. Secretary of Defense, the U.S. got a man whom the Washington Post called the leading proponent not only of national missile defenses, but also of U.S. efforts to take control of outer space. The U.S. Space Command's long-range plan starts out by stating it's been the U.S. Space Command's #1 priority, and the development and production process by design involved hundreds of people, including about 75 corporations. It lists the corporations, beginning with Aerojet and going through Boeing, Hughes Space, Lockheed Martin, Rand Corp, Raytheon, Sparta Corp, TRW to Vista Technologies. President Dwight Eisenhower warned in his farewell address to the nation in 1961 of the rise of a military-industrial complex. Now is the time, says the long-range plan, to begin developing space capabilities. Space power in the 21st century looks similar to previous military revolutions, such as aircraft carrier warfare and blitzkrieg. Says Guardians of the High Frontier, an Air Force Space Command report, space is the ultimate high ground. Master of Space is a motto of the Air Force Space Command. Master of Space appears as a Space Command uniform patch and is emblazoned on the front entrance of a major Space Command element, the 50th Space Wing in Colorado. master of space that pretty well sums up the U.S. military attitude towards space.
Well, the whole idea of one country deciding that they're going to be the master of space, or the Ubermeister of the world, if you will, is, I think, a violation, number one, of international law, the Outer Space Treaty that says the heavens are the province of all humankind. The whole notion that one country will militarily control the world, I think, is extremely destabilizing and is a threat to international peace and security. The only way we're going to truly have peace in this world is to sit down, negotiate treaties, honor treaties. And the fact that the United States wants to go forward and violate the anti-ballistic missile treaty that we negotiated with Russia in 1972 is an indication that we're heading in the opposite direction.
I would hate the idea of anyone wanting to dominate the world. I mean, we tried it, or the Germans tried it during the Nazi time, and the world didn't really like it. I don't think we need a policeman up in space controlling all the world, but we should work on an equal level and on a cooperative level to sort things out and to use space peacefully, certainly, but not use it for military purposes at all.
What we're talking about here is the fact that the United States military wants to be the policeman not just of the world, but the policeman of outer space as well. Some people say, what's wrong with that? We're the good guys. We're John Wayne. What's wrong with having us in outer space be the top cop on the block? Because it'll destabilize the entire balance of power. The Chinese have already stated that they will pierce and overwhelm a Star Wars program which is only effective against 20 missiles. And 20 missiles is all the Chinese have. And the Chinese have stated that they think the Star Wars program is directed against them, and they will pierce and penetrate a Star Wars shield. Then the Indians have stated that if the Chinese are going to increase their nuclear arsenal, then they have to, as a question of national pride and security, increase their nuclear arsenal as well. And then the Pakistanis have stated that if the Indians increase their arsenal, they have no choice but to increase the number of weapons in their arsenal. And so the question we have to ask is, do you feel more secure knowing that a Star Wars program which may not work will instigate a new arms race with the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, and the Pakistanis openly stating that they cannot let the United States be the top cop on the block?
Far more than reports and rhetoric are involved. Now underway is the Space-Based Laser Demonstrator Project, a development program for this project, which the U.S. military says has a life cycle budget of $20 to $30 billion, has begun. Here's a promotional poster showing the laser firing its ray in space while a U.S. flag somehow manages to wave in space above it. Boeing and Lockheed Martin and TRW are partners in this laser. A second space-based laser, already test-fired more than 20 times, is the Alpha high-energy laser built by TRW.
The rest of the world perceives Star Wars as a first strike system. The Russians, the Chinese, they're not stupid. If the United States comes out with a bulletproof vest to protect itself, it means the United States can fire from behind the bulletproof vest with impunity. So where's it going to end? This was supposed to be a defensive shield, a shield for peace. Now we know that it's really a first strike weapon system for world domination, and it's also something that is sparking a new arms race as the Russians, the Chinese, and now the Indians say that they want to build a system that will pierce, penetrate, underfly, overfly, and overwhelm and fool a Star Wars program.
Some $6 billion plus funds in the black being spent secretly have been going into U.S. space military activities annually. In recent years, what Ronald Reagan in 1983 called the Strategic Defense Initiative has been renamed National Missile Defense. In the fuller picture, what is sought is largely offensive. Indeed, U.S. military documents consistently describe missile defense as just one layer in a broad U.S. program of space warfare.
What the United States should do, instead of arming the heavens, instead of deploying nuclear weapons and the latest weaponry in outer space, is to begin the process of demilitarization on the planet Earth, to sign treaties to resolve political conflicts without expensive military hardware, because that only increases the escalation of a new round in the arms race. It's much cheaper and ultimately politically wiser to begin the process of negotiations rather than the militarization of space.
Well aware of U.S. space warfare plans, other nations of the world arranged for a vote in the United Nations General Assembly on November 20th, 2000, to reaffirm the Outer Space Treaty and specifically its provision that space be reserved for peaceful uses. Some 163 nations voted for the resolution titled Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space. It declared that the use of space shall be for peaceful purposes, carried out for the benefit and in the interest of all countries. The U.S. abstained. Ironically, it was the U.S. that was deeply involved in initiating the Outer Space Treaty. Craig Eisenrath was in the U.S. State Department at that time and central to drafting the treaty.
In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik. In early '58, the United States responded, and the space race was on. And it became very clear that there were a number of major issues that had to be solved quickly. One of them was, who owns outer space? You had to solve the issue who actually owned it. Another issue had to be, what happens to astronauts or space vehicles if they come down on somebody else's territory? Another very serious question was, where is outer space? Where does it start? Where does it end? A much more serious issue was, how are you going to keep outer space out of the arms race? And so a number of people in the State Department, particularly in the legal office and in the political section where I was working, began working on an outer space treaty. In 1963, there was a UN agreement, a General Assembly agreement, which dealt with some of these aspects. And then in '67, that agreement was extended to restrict the militarization of space. The intent was to keep space out of the arms race, to keep it free of weapons, no weapons of mass destruction, and no using of space as another theater for military operations.
The final wording of the treaty prohibits nations from placing nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction in space. To clear up any confusion and specifically bar any weapons in space, both Canada and China have been active at the UN in seeking to bolster the Outer Space Treaty with an agreement to ban all weapons in space. And Eisenrath says what the U.S. is up to now is a violation of the treaty.
The putting of lasers, I think the putting of guidance systems in outer space, certainly the putting of any kind of warhead in outer space is totally against the intent of the treaty. And I think what we are now is on a path by which we're going to subvert the treaty. Interestingly enough, the current administration is trying to get out of these kinds of restrictions. Look at the policy, for instance, for the ABM Treaty. The ABM Treaty is now called a relic of the Cold War. And you're going to see each one of the major arms control agreements put in that context, because what the current administration wants is unilateralism. That is, the right to do whatever we want, when we want to do it, without the restrictions of international agreements.
I mean, that treaty is ancient history.
Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld is Mr. Star Wars. He has staked his entire professional reputation on building a Star Wars system. But the problem is, Rumsfeld and Bush and Cheney are in too deep. They are too close to Lockheed Martin. They're too close to the weapons manufacturers. They need a Star Wars system to keep the profits going and to command the high ground of outer space.
If we're going to get into space, we shouldn't be worried about a treaty or somebody hurting somebody's feelings. I think as Secretary Rumsfeld just came back from Europe and he met with many of the European leaders, and he basically said, look, If a missile defense or assets in space are in the national security interest of the United States, we're going to do it. We're going to protect ourselves. And hopefully you guys will join us, but if not, we need to move forward.
Worst of all, with this intention to go ahead with a national missile defense program, is it is only the tip of the iceberg. It is really an excuse to put U.S. weapons in space. This is nothing more than a threat to make space a new battleground which the United States will dominate and render the rest of the world subject to our dominion from space. And all we will have started by putting weapons into space is to ensure that other nations in the years ahead will make their own space warfare efforts, and we will have succeeded in increasing the danger to the United States of America and its citizens.
The U.S. military sees nuclear power systems orbiting in space as necessary to power weapons in space.
In outer space, there are no extension cords. Therefore, the military has experimented with a number of methods to get unlimited power to energize their space-based systems. RTGs, for example, will get you a limited amount of electricity with plutonium. But the military would really like to go to full-blown nuclear reactors in outer space. If you have a laser beam based in outer space or a particle beam weapon, you have to supply large quantities of electrical power to energize the system. And the only known way of getting such fabulous amounts of cheap portable power is with nuclear power plants in outer space.
As the U.S. Air Force Board report, New World Vistas, Air and Space Power for the 21st Century states, a natural technology to enable high power is nuclear power in space. Setting the emotional issues of nuclear power aside, this technology offers a viable alternative for large amounts of power in space. Indeed, a key reason why NASA insists on using nuclear power in space is its desire to coordinate its activities with the U.S. military.
We sometimes forget that NASA and the Pentagon are very close when it comes to funding. For example, in the initial stages, 50% of the funding of the Space Shuttle mission came from the Pentagon. We forget the fact that there are entire Space Shuttle missions that are funded exclusively by the Pentagon to launch military satellites and to test Star Wars-type machinery in outer space. Therefore, it's not a surprise that the military is very much interested in perfecting plutonium power packs.
The U.S. has launched almost 30 nuclear-powered space devices, and there's been accidents, including the SNAP 9A crashing back to Earth, spreading deadly plutonium. Moreover, in 2003, the U.S. embarked on Project Prometheus, a multi-billion-dollar program increasing the use of space nuclear power, including building nuclear rockets. Yet the European Space Agency in 2004 launched its Rosetta space probe, energized by solar cells rather than nuclear power. Using safe solar energy, it's the rendezvous with a comet near Jupiter.
When you hear about the potential dangers of the militarization of outer space, there are several things that the average citizen can do. First, get informed. Go beyond the propaganda. Go beyond the mythology that we're simply exploring outer space to satisfy our scientific curiosity. Realize that one of the main engines behind this has been the Pentagon, which desires to use the high ground of outer space for its weaponry. And then, after you go beyond the propaganda, get active. Join an organization. Write to your congressman or congresswoman. Get politically active in order to make sure that social change is a byproduct of our education. And remember, it's just not you. It's your children. It's the environment. It's our future. Our future depends upon a space that is free of nuclear weapons, free of nuclear power plants. Our world depends upon an environment that is clean, healthy, and is for everyone, not just the multinational corporations.
Among U.S. public officials strongly against Star Wars is Congressman Dennis Kucinich of Ohio. Here he is giving the keynote speech at the international meeting in Washington in 2000 of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space.
When we see the presence of so many thousands of our brothers and sisters in this Capitol today and tomorrow to protest the policies of the International Monetary Fund, the structural adjustment policies, which are crushing people, countries around the world, which are making it impossible for them to have decent living conditions. When we see the World Bank being used as an institution that makes it even tougher for countries to be able to meet the needs of their population, I think that we can come to an understanding that this policy can only lead to more instability around the world. And what it should lead to, and what it must lead to, is a reawakening of a social consciousness in this country to challenge our fellow citizens to realize that we are creating the seeds of the destruction of people all over this world, and it inevitably will come back to this country as well. Because it is a moral issue. We're a country that should be about turning swords into plowshares, and that's what the ABM Treaty was about. Not in fashioning new, technologically superior swords to hold like swords of Damocles over the populations of the world. We cannot survive as a nation with that approach. We need to, as a nation, encourage our citizenry to be active citizens in changing the political process. And so what you need to do is to inspire people to recognize the potency of their own involvement, of their ability to make a difference, of the necessity of each person standing up and speaking out, of the necessity of us collectively challenging the policies at the ballot box and, if necessary, in the streets of this nation.
And I think what we really need to have is a new link, new intimate link between the environmental movement, the justice movement, and the peace movement.
United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan, in opening the third UN Conference on Exploration and Peaceful Uses of Outer Space in 1999, declared, above all, we must guard against the misuse of outer space. We cannot view the expanse of space as another battleground for our earthly conflicts. This, however, is not the vision of the United States government. There must be strong opposition in the United States and international action to stop Star Wars, to prevent the heavens from being turned into a war zone. There needs to be global agreement banning all weapons in space. We must work, and we'll have to work fast and hard to keep space for peace. This has been Carl Grossman. Thanks for watching.